352-237-2557. KingCookieOcala.com. Customized cookies, cakes, and more. King Cookie.
Eating cookies. We're so happy eating cookies.
Ocala's information station, 1370 WOCA.
Ocala.
Diamonds in the sunset, now your time has come. A pretty yellow bird fly away into the sun.
All right. Thank you so much for tuning in. One of the compliments we get, I guess comments is a better word than compliments, but we get compliments too. One of the comments we get a lot is that when we speak to an author with a really, really great book, everybody seems to love that because a lot of times the book is not something they've heard of or they're hearing it for the first time here. You're going to love this one. Brian Peyton Joyner has written this book that just will make you think. It'll take you back in time. It'll make you appreciate your families, your close loved ones. Brian wrote this book called The Wisdom of Stones. Brian, by the way, served 20 years as a corporate attorney. He's an inspirational speaker. He's an advocate for agreeable disagreement. Oh my gosh, so am I. And the book is just so beautifully written. The Wisdom of Stones, getting really good reviews on Amazon. Let's say hello to Brian. Good morning, sir. What an honor. Thank you for being on our show.
Hi, good morning. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Where are you calling from?
I am in Palm Springs, California.
Oh, my goodness.
Where it is sunny and cool today, so that'll only get up to 90.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a little overcast here, but thank you for getting up early to be with us today.
No worries.
Tell me about the story, and where was the origin of the story? How did this idea come to you?
So the Wisdom of Stones sort of follows a young man as he's coming of age, and he's a senior in college. And his entire life, or ever since the time he was 13, he has wanted to be a Southern Baptist minister. When he was 13 years old, his Mima got cancer, and he prayed to God, "If you'll heal her, I'll give my life to you." And as a result of that, God healed her, and then he went on to be a religion major. And then ultimately, he got to the point where his Mima sort of came to him and said, "Look, I know that you have these attractions to other guys. You need to go and you need to get cured, and you need to, and I still want you to be a pastor, but you've got to take care of this issue first." And Grandpa had a little bit different view, and Grandpa had a really interesting life. He had been a hobo. He'd bootlegged moonshine during Prohibition. And one of the stories that Ben learns is that Grandpa also had an interracial relationship in the 1930s. And that's one thing that Grandpa sort of tells him has been sort of struggling with, coming to terms with being gay. And the idea for the story, The Wisdom of Stones, though, came about in 2010 when I was in a writing group, and we had to write about a collection. And just something that popped into my head was this idea of this 6-year-old boy who was going around on his grandparents' property. And I used to go visit my grandparents all the time when I was a kid. We'd have Sunday dinner there all the time. But the kid would go around, and he would go down by the creek, and he would find a stone. And his grandpa collects stones, and he would take the stone to his grandpa, and he would trade him a stone for one of Grandpa's stories. And that idea of a stone for a story, and the way that our older generations and our parents and our grandparents can pass along their wisdom, became
That's
sort of
awesome.
the basis for the book.
I love that idea. And I wonder if anybody, how long has the book been out?
It's been out a month.
Okay, so not long enough yet for you to get feedback, or am I wrong about this, where people are saying, I've started this tradition in my own family?
I haven't had anybody say that, but I have had someone who had told me about sort of something that she had with her grandmother, that she would find kind of some different yarn or something like that when she was out at a different shop, and she would take it to her grandmother, and they would just sit there on a Sunday afternoon, and they would knit together, and her grandma would sort of tell her a story. And it is somehow, she said her grandma always had sort of stories inspired by the different colors and different types of yarn that she would bring her. So I think we all, many people do have something like that in their past where they may have some sort of connection, because I think objects certainly give us connection to memories and to our past. And the first stone that Ben finds is when he's 6 years old at the gravesite at his mother's funeral, and he's really upset. And he's seen in a movie one time where people would take some dirt and drop it into the grave, and there's a big mound of dirt. I grew up in South Carolina, so of course it's the red Georgia clay, and he's grabbing a big chunk of clay and throwing it in the ground, and he ends up finding this pink quartz arrowhead. And Grandpa sort of says that quartz arrowhead reminds him of a baseball team called the Atlanta Crackers. That was actually a real-life baseball team back in the 30s, and they used to play at this Ponce de Leon field in Georgia.
The lessons that the book, or that the characters learn in the book, are about learning to love. They're about learning to love and learning to love unconditionally, where you don't love somebody because of a label that might be attached to them. I'm just guessing that this is an important aspect of who you are.
Yes, absolutely. I still have all of my families in South Carolina, and my mother goes to a Southern Baptist church, and I'm sure a lot of people at that church don't necessarily agree with how I live my life, but my mother very much has embraced my husband, and we sort of look beyond that because we are family. And I just think there's times that she sees me as her son, I see her as my mother, and even though we may not agree on everything, we still allow those bonds to hold us together and focus more on what our similarities are and versus our differences. And I think that's an important lesson, obviously, in the world we live in today.
There was a baseball manager, I think it was, one of the New York teams, I think, and he was upset because people were picking on one of the players because he came out as gay. And the baseball manager, and forgive me, I'm not a sports guy, so I forget these guys' names, but he said something pretty profound. He said, I don't care who you choose to love, just play the game. Right. he was very accepting of what the guy. And I've thought this all along. I thought, if I go to you and you're a baker, and you make a nice Kaiser roll, that's all I care about. Right. It doesn't matter a whole lot to me who's your best friend or who's your lover. It doesn't matter to me.
Right. Well, I think that's definitely a sort of a strong message from the book, and I draw a lot of parallels between sort of how black-white relationships were treated in the South in the 1930s to sort of how gay relationships were sort of handled in the 1990s, and that's where the book is set in the early 1990s.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, so I haven't quite yet figured out how the next book I'm writing is going to be set in 2008. I haven't quite yet figured out how to write a book where everyone is on their iTunes and tweeting and FaceTiming.
Right. But the thing about the South, I live in the South and I grew up in the North, and I've noticed this, that we had as Northerners this misconception about the South. And there's also misconception about ourselves up north in thinking that somehow we were less likely to be prejudiced or less likely to be discriminating because of race or anything. We were just as likely. The truth is, we were just as likely. And so I think I think you hit it on the head when you're talking about a period in time as opposed to a physical location. Now, you might disagree with that because in your own experience, you might have experienced something different, for example, in California than in South Carolina.
Right.
And maybe the racial thing versus the sexual orientation thing is two different things. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I was born and reared in South Carolina. I went to college in South Carolina, and at the time, I had sort of a really thick accent because I went from college to graduate school upstate in upstate New York. And my accent wasn't that beautiful Charleston, low country drawl. It was kind of that maybe people think about as being hickish. And then when I spoke that way, people would say, oh, you're a Southerner, you're backwards. And I would sort of have to stop them and say, look, in the South, we have a very strong sense of tradition. And, historically, that has meant that the South does have a racist past. I'm not going to wash over that, but the racism for me was more in the abstract, and it wasn't with regards to individuals. Like my mama taught me, you treat everyone with respect. And so when I left and I went to the South and I went to New York or Chicago or other places, then I sort of carried that along with me of treating individuals with respect. And sort of my Southern roots taught me the importance of tradition. And so I would want to meet people and learn and find out about their traditions and sort of their past. And I use that as a way to understand them. And that for me, as a Southerner, I think is very important. If we sort of hold on to our traditions, but recognize what really are our traditions that, are important and are going to carry us forward into this next century. I think it's that sense of, sort of understanding of where other people come from and wanting to understand that, because that is important.
Yeah.
And that's an extremely keen observation, because you yourself, you went through the path of college, graduate school, you were an attorney, and that's like a path that was laid out for you. But then you had this passion to be a writer and a speaker that influences a lot of people. And you took that leap from safety to the unexpected.
Yeah, that was a great time. And I've always had a passion for writing, as you mentioned. When I was 6 years old, I wrote my first short story, and Mama's I don't know where she's keeping all these things, but every now and then she'll just pull something out of some magic box she has. It's like a time machine, and she'll send it to me. And she sent me this story I'd written. I had no recollection of, but I was 6 years old, and it was about two left shoes, and those two left shoes wanted to be together. The world told them, well, a left shoe can only be with the right shoe, but the two left shoes fell in love. They decided they'd get married, and they eventually, after a couple years, had kids.
Wow, that's funny.
Pause for the bad.
That's funny.
Pause for the bad.
Had kids. That was pretty funny.
Yeah.
That was very clever.
Yeah,
very clever.
Took a while. Kids. I haven't heard kids in a long time. I haven't heard kids. So in the book, does the character get cured of being gay? Is that what happens? Or at least the elders think he has been?
Yeah. So what happens in the book is he goes through what I came up with called the Homo Nomo program. Sort of stands for homosexual no more. And his mentor and the sort of the pastor at the church, the chaplain at the church, at the school, the college that he goes to, has this program where he basically tries to learn all he can about all the negative things and all the bad things, where he's going to die of AIDS and that sort of stuff. And he wears a rubber band on his wrist. Whenever he gets an attraction, he snaps it. So it's sort of negative reinforcement. He prays and tries to get closer to God. He writes a letter to his same-sex attraction and says goodbye to them. He does have a point where he thinks that he's cured. And I got to that point in my life as well, where I really thought, okay, I no longer have these attractions. And I think when you look at sort of the gay conversion therapies, a lot of people sort of get to that moment, but then it's just a moment. It's not something that is long-lived. And really in the book, the character thinks he's cured, but then he realizes that he's not. And at the very end of the book, though, he comes to terms with the fact that this is not something that can be cured, but he's not at the point where he's sort of saying, okay, yeah, I can live my life, however I want. He still has this very strong sort of Christian ethics, and he's sort of looking to see, okay, well, where do I go from here? I'm no longer going to focus on, this notion that I somehow am not a whole person and I need to be cured. But he's not sort of abandoning all of his faith and everything, and then moving to a completely different lifestyle. So the ending's not a Hollywood ending, I guess. It's very kind of muddy, but I think that's the situation. Well, and even the past. Yeah,
that's probably the honest ending, though. I wondered if you went through the same thing where you were told you would have the phantom attraction. Like when you lose a leg, in the book you talk about somebody who's lost a limb. Sometimes feels like they still have it. Mm-hmm. So if you've lost the attraction, you sometimes have this phantom attraction. Did that happen to you? Or is that just you don't really lose it, though, like you would a leg.
Yeah, right. That's the thing. That's where the preacher, I think, is engaging in some really manipulative